Welcome to Unit 7, Topic 5, where we will examine the unresolved tensions that persisted after World War I. This video will explore the global conflicts over territory and power that set the stage for future world conflicts. Our learning objective is to explain the continuities and changes in territorial holdings from 1900 to the present. The historical development focuses on how Western and Japanese imperial states maintained or gained control over colonial holdings between the world wars, often facing anti-imperial resistance. After World War I, leaders around the world were looking for a way to prevent another global conflict. That's where the League of Nations comes in. Established in 1920, the League of Nations was the first major international organization created with the goal of maintaining world peace. It was formed during the Paris Peace Conference and officially created through the Treaty of Versailles. The idea behind the League was pretty ambitious. Countries would work together to prevent future wars through collective security, meaning that if one nation was threatened, others would step in to help. They also promoted disarmament and encouraged countries to resolve conflicts through negotiation instead of violence. Now, the League had several different roles, but for this lesson, we're going to focus specifically on how it dealt with territorial issues after World War I. One of its main functions was to provide a space where countries could bring disputes and try to resolve them through dialogue, arbitration, and investigation before things escalated into war. Another key responsibility was the mandate system. This system placed former territories of the defeated Central Powers under the control of more powerful nations, with the expectation that these territories would eventually move toward independence.
So, under the League of Nations mandate system, territories that had belonged to the defeated powers in World War I were handed over to the victorious nations. These were called mandates. In theory, the goal was to prepare these regions for self-rule and eventual independence. But in reality, this often looked a lot like a continuation of imperialism, just under a different name. The League divided these mandates into three categories based on how ready they were believed to be for self-government. Class A mandates were considered the closest to independence. These included places like parts of the Middle East. Class B mandates were seen as less developed and were given more direct control by the mandatory powers. And Class C mandates were treated as the least ready. These territories were often governed as if they were basically part of the controlling country itself. On the slide, you can see the original document outlining these categories: Class A in red, Class B in blue, and Class C in yellow. Now this is a great moment to pause and get students thinking. Ask yourself, how do you think people living in these territories felt about this system? From their perspective, this could easily look like colonialism continuing under a new label. It also reflects a clear hierarchy, where outside powers are deciding which societies are ready for independence and which are not. That idea alone can feel very paternalistic. In places like Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, where nationalist movements were already growing, the mandate system may have felt like a betrayal, especially after promises of self-determination during the war. At the same time, the promise of eventual independence could also fuel political activism and organized resistance. And of course, there's the question of resources. Many people likely saw this system as a way for powerful countries to continue exploiting land and resources. Now, let's look at a specific example of a Class A mandate, starting with the British mandate for Palestine and Transjordan. This mandate was officially established in 1922, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire following World War I. Although Britain had already been in control of the region since 1918, the League of Nations gave it formal authority through the mandate system. The legal foundation for this came from the Treaty of Sèvres, and later the Treaty of Lausanne. But here's where things start to get complicated. During the war, Britain had made conflicting promises to different groups. On one hand, the Balfour Declaration in 1917 expressed support for creating a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. At the same time, British officials had also made promises to Arab leaders, suggesting they would support Arab independence in exchange for help fighting the Ottomans. So right from the beginning, Britain is trying to manage two groups with competing national goals. During the mandate period, Jewish immigration to Palestine increased significantly. This was driven by Zionist movements, and later by people fleeing anti-Semitism and the Holocaust in Europe. However, this growing population created tension with the Arab population already living in the region. That tension often turned into violence, making the mandate increasingly difficult for Britain to manage. In 1921, Britain separated the land east of the Jordan River and created Transjordan. This area was given limited self-rule under Abdullah I, but it still remained under British oversight. Transjordan would eventually gain full independence in 1946. Now, although we'll go into more detail in Unit 8, it's important to understand how this mandate ends. By 1947, Britain could no longer manage the conflict between Jewish and Arab groups. so they turned the issue over to the United Nations. The UN proposed a plan to divide the land into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under international control. Jewish leaders accepted this plan, but Arab leaders rejected it. The mandate officially ended in 1948, which led to the creation of the State of Israel, and almost immediately, the start of the Arab-Israeli War. And one reason I like starting with this example is because it's a region students are often somewhat familiar with. It makes it easier to see how these tensions didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were shaped during the mandate period itself. Now let's look at another Class A mandate, the French Mandate for Syria and Lebanon. This mandate was part of the larger division of the Ottoman Empire. After World War I, France officially gained control through the League of Nations in 1923, although it had already begun establishing authority in the region by 1920. The mandate included what we now know as Syria and Lebanon, along with parts of surrounding areas. Like the British, the French justified their control by claiming these regions were not yet ready for self-government and needed guidance to develop politically and economically. And this is a great place to make a connection back to Unit 6, because that justification should sound very familiar. It closely mirrors the reasoning used to justify imperialism. In practice, though, French rule focused heavily on maintaining control and protecting its own strategic and economic interests, and it faced strong resistance from local populations. To strengthen its control, France divided the region into multiple political units. Lebanon was designed to have a Christian majority and was intended to be a kind of model state, but because of its mixed population, this created long-term political and religious tensions. Syria itself was split into several smaller states, including areas like Damascus and Aleppo, as well as regions for minority groups like the Alawites and Druze. Many Syrians strongly opposed this division, seeing it as an attempt to weaken national unity and delay independence. France also expanded what became known as Greater Lebanon by adding Muslim-majority areas, which further complicated the region's balance. And finally, the Sanjak of Alexandretta, later known as Hatay, was eventually separated and became part of Turkey in 1939. Overall, this mandate is a clear example of how European powers used the system not just to govern, but to reshape regions in ways that often increased division and tension, rather than preparing them for independence.
The way France divided and governed Syria ended up doing the opposite of what they intended. It actually strengthened nationalist movements. Many people in the region wanted independence, not foreign control, and French policies only made those frustrations worse. This led to major resistance, including the Great Syrian Revolt from 1925 to 1927. That revolt was driven by several factors: high taxes, attempts at forced military service, limited political freedoms, and very little real local control. There were also issues with land. In some cases, land was given to outsiders, which displaced local populations and increased resentment. At the same time, ideas of Arab nationalism, sometimes called Pan-Arabism, were spreading across the Middle East. These ideas emphasized unity and independence from foreign powers, and they became a powerful force in mobilizing people against French rule. So the big takeaway here is pretty straightforward. Instead of preparing these territories for independence, the French mandate actually intensified nationalist feelings and strengthened the push for self-rule. Now let's look at one more example, this time from Africa. German East Africa was Germany's largest overseas colony before World War I. After the war, most of this territory was transferred to Britain under the Mandate system and became known as Tanganyika. Under British control, the focus was mainly on economic development, especially agriculture and infrastructure. This included building railways and roads, largely to support the movement of goods and resources. Tanganyika eventually gained independence in 1961, and a few years later, in 1964, it united with Zanzibar to form what we now know as Tanzania. On the slide, you can also see Askari soldiers, African troops who served under German command, pictured here in 1896 during the colonial period. Another example comes from Southwest Africa, which is today Namibia. After World War I, this territory was placed under South African control through the Mandate system. At the time, South Africa was a British dominion. Instead of preparing the region for independence, South Africa applied its apartheid policies there. This led to long-term resistance and conflict within the territory. It's also important to note that the international community never fully recognized South Africa's control. Because of that, Southwest Africa remained under League of Nations and later United Nations supervision until it finally gained independence in 1990. So, what we see here and in the other examples is a pattern. The territories of the defeated powers, like Germany and the Ottoman Empire, were taken and redistributed to Britain and France and their allies. While this was framed as a system to prepare regions for independence, in many cases, it functioned more like a continuation of imperial control. Now we're shifting to a different example of territorial control, this time in East Asia. In 1932, Japan established a puppet state called Manchukuo in the region of Manchuria in northeastern China. This was part of Japan's growing expansionist policies in the years leading up to World War II. Manchukuo wasn't truly independent. It was controlled by Japan and served its political and economic interests. For Japan, this was about more than just territory. Manchukuo became a key piece of its broader goal to dominate Asia. It was both a symbol of Japanese power and a strategic step toward building what Japan called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. On paper, this idea was presented as a partnership of Asian nations working together for mutual benefit, free from Western imperialism. But in reality, it allowed Japan to expand its military presence and exploit resources across the region. The creation of Manchukuo also marked the beginning of more aggressive expansion by Japan, which increased tensions in Asia and helped set the stage for World War II.
To understand how Japan took control of Manchuria, we need to look at the Mukden incident in 1931. This event served as the excuse Japan used to justify its invasion. In reality, the incident was staged by the Japanese military, specifically the Kwantung Army. They set off a small explosion on a section of railway they controlled, the South Manchurian Railway, near the city of Mukden, which is modern-day Shenyang. Japan then blamed Chinese forces for the sabotage. Using that as justification, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of Manchuria. Within just a few months, Japanese troops had taken control of the region and established the puppet state of Manchukuo. This was a major escalation in Japan's imperial expansion and a clear challenge to the international system at the time. The League of Nations did condemn Japan's actions, but instead of backing down, Japan simply withdrew from the League altogether. On the slide, you can see Japanese officials inspecting the railway after the so-called attack.
Manchukuo was presented as an independent state, but in reality, it was controlled by Japan. Its official leader was Puyi, the last emperor of China, but he had very little real power. Instead, the Japanese Kwantung Army made the key decisions and used Manchukuo to serve Japan's economic and military goals. Japan invested in infrastructure like railways and factories, but this development was designed to benefit Japan, not the local population. Manchuria was rich in natural resources, and those resources were heavily exploited to support Japan's industrial growth and military expansion. This came at a cost. Local populations faced harsh treatment, and the environment was often damaged in the process. There were also major consequences beyond the region. Internationally, Japan's actions led to growing isolation. After the League of Nations condemned its invasion, Japan withdrew from the League in 1933. This marked a turning point, as Japan moved further away from international cooperation and toward militarism. At the same time, the resources gained from Manchukuo helped fuel Japan's expansion in the short term, but ultimately contributed to its involvement in World War II. And in the long term, the exploitation and violence in Manchukuo deepened tensions between Japan and China, tensions that would last well beyond the war. So overall, Manchukuo is a clear example of how imperial expansion can bring short-term gains, but lead to long-term consequences and conflict.
The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was a central idea in Japanese foreign policy. Japan promoted it as a plan to unite Asian countries under its leadership and free them from Western colonial rule. This vision really begins with places like Manchukuo, which Japan used as a model for what this system could look like. On the surface, Japan framed this as cooperation, an opportunity for shared economic growth, stability, and independence from Western influence. It was presented as a kind of Asian solidarity. But in reality, this cooperation mostly benefited Japan. The goal was to secure resources, labor, and markets to support Japan's growing industrial and military power. So instead of liberation, many regions experienced control, exploitation, and harsh rule under Japanese authority. This idea is important because it helps explain Japan's expansion across Asia and its growing role in the lead-up to World War II. On the slide, you can see a Japanese propaganda poster from 1935 promoting unity between Japan, China, and Manchukuo, claiming that together they could bring peace to the world.
Now we're going to shift our focus from Japan to China. This next section introduces a short excerpt from a historical study that looks at how war and society were developing in Manchuria during the 1920s. But before we look at that excerpt, we need a little bit of background. In this region, there was a powerful Chinese military faction known as the Fengtian clique, or the Fengtian Army. They were based in northeastern China, in what was then called Fengtian Province, an area that largely overlaps with Manchuria. This group controlled and governed much of the region during the early 20th century. They also had a complicated relationship with Japan. In some cases, they cooperated with Japanese forces to maintain stability and protect shared interests in the area, especially before the Mukden incident. Understanding this group is important because it helps explain how power was already being contested in Manchuria before Japan's full invasion. So as we move to the next slide, we're going to look at how members of this faction viewed their role in this changing post-World War I world.
For Fengtian officers, World War I confirmed that survival of the fittest, not international cooperation, defined the world order. They distrusted post-war pacifism, viewing the Peace of Versailles as a mere truce, believing China's survival depended solely on military might.
Now that you've read the source, let's walk through these questions together. For the first question, what did World War I reveal to the Fengtian officers? Their takeaway was pretty blunt. They believed the international system wasn't really about cooperation or peace. It was about survival of the fittest. In other words, stronger nations dominate, and weaker ones fall behind. For the second question, what did they think China needed in order to survive? Their answer was simple: military strength. They didn't see diplomacy or international agreements as reliable. Instead, they believed that only a strong military could protect China's independence and security. And that leads directly into the third question. How does this perspective relate to ideas about international peace? It clearly challenges them. The Fengtian officers saw peace efforts as unrealistic in a world where power, not cooperation, determines outcomes. So overall, this source shows us a shift in thinking. Rather than trusting international systems like the League of Nations, these leaders believed survival depended on strength and preparedness for conflict. Now, we're shifting to a different response to imperialism, this time in India. The Indian National Congress, or INC, was founded in 1885 as more Indians began to challenge British rule and push back against discriminatory policies. At first, the INC was mostly a forum for educated elites, calling for moderate reforms. But over time, it grew into a mass movement, leading the fight for independence. A major turning point came with the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi. By 1920, Gandhi had become the central figure in the movement and introduced a new strategy: nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience. This approach was based on his philosophy of satyagraha, which emphasized truth, moral strength, and nonviolent action. During the interwar period, these ideas shaped a series of major campaigns that redefined how Indians resisted British control and pushed for self-rule.
Let's take a look at some of the major movements led by Gandhi and the Indian National Congress. First, the non-cooperation movement from 1920 to 1922. This was Gandhi's first major campaign, and the idea was simple. If Indians stopped cooperating with British rule, it would become impossible to maintain. People were encouraged to boycott British goods, leave government schools and courts, and even return honors given by the British. What made this powerful was the level of participation. It showed that mass non-violent resistance could actually challenge imperial control. Next, the civil disobedience movement, starting in 1930. This is where we see the famous Salt March. Gandhi led a 240-mile march to the coast to make salt, directly defying British law. At the time, the British had a monopoly on salt and heavily taxed it. even though it was a basic necessity. This act of defiance sparked similar protests across India and helped unite people from different backgrounds against British rule. Around the same time, we also have the Round Table Conferences in London. These were meant to discuss political reforms in India, and Gandhi attended as a representative of the INC. However, the talks failed to deliver real progress toward independence. When Gandhi returned to India, he was arrested, and the civil disobedience movement continued to grow. And just as a preview, we'll revisit this in Unit 8 with the Quit India movement in 1942 as the push for independence continues.
The National Congress of British West Africa, NCBWA, was founded in 1920. It represented an early form of Pan-Africanism, uniting educated elites from the British colonies of the Gambia, Sierra Leone, Gold Coast, now Ghana, and Nigeria. The Congress was spearheaded by individuals such as Joseph Casely Hayford, pictured right, from the Gold Coast, who envisioned a collective effort to address the political, social, and economic grievances caused by colonial rule. It was one of the first major organizations whose goal was African independence from colonial powers. Its primary objectives included the promotion of unity and cooperation among British West African colonies, the establishment of a West African Court of Appeal, the formation of a legislative council in each colony with significant African representation, and the improvement of educational opportunities, along with the development of social and economic infrastructure. The Congress convened for the first time in Accra, Gold Coast, in 1920, and held several meetings thereafter. During these gatherings, delegates drafted memoranda and resolutions that were sent to the British colonial authorities and the Colonial Office in London, advocating for constitutional reforms and greater African participation in the governance of their own affairs. Despite facing resistance from colonial officials and limited immediate success, the NCBWA laid crucial groundwork for subsequent nationalist movements across West Africa. The efforts of the NCBWA and its calls for reform can be seen as precursors to the more intense struggles for independence that swept across Africa in the decades following World War II, leading eventually to the decolonization of the continent, which we will visit in Unit 8 when we get to decolonization. Pictured left is the Prince of Wales shaking hands with the members of the Ladies' Branch of the National Congress of British West Africa in 1925. Photo credit by the National Archives UK, OGL version 1.0, https://commons.wikimedia.org/w/index.php ? Curate equals 199044794.
To wrap up, these are the key ideas you should be familiar with for topic 7.5. Make sure you understand how empires expanded and controlled territory in the interwar period, whether through mandate systems or direct imperialism. You should also be able to explain how systems like the League of Nations mandates were presented as steps toward independence, but often functioned as a continuation of imperial control. Be familiar with examples like the Middle East mandates and how they contributed to long-term regional tensions. You should also understand how Japan expanded in East Asia, especially through Manchukuo and the idea of the co-prosperity sphere. And finally, make sure you can explain how different groups responded to imperialism, like the Indian National Congress using nonviolent resistance to push for independence. If you can connect these examples back to the bigger themes of power, control, and resistance, you'll be in a really strong position for this topic.